Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. A warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third United Nations South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. This is the session titled Broadening Societal Engagement for Businesses and Human Rights in Sri Lanka. I'm Prabina Shrestha from Q Design. With my colleague Monica Shrestha, we will be your technical facilitators for today. The chat function is unable for this session, so if you have any questions for the speakers, please use the chat box. Please note that the session today is recorded and live streamed on YouTube. If you have any questions about Zoom or require technical assistance, please feel free to raise your hand or drop a message into the chat box. I will now hand over to Mr. Surya Deva, member UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Mr. Surya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Surya Dev. I'm a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this particular session on looking at the business and human rights landscape in Sri Lanka. We have a very distinguished panel of 4 experts who will share their reflections in this particular session. And I'm sure there will be time for questions and comments as well after their initial round of interventions. Now, business and human rights is a relatively new concept for countries in South Asia, including Sri Lanka. But issues about corporate social responsibility, sustainable development, or sustainability as such, and issues about sustainable development goals are being on the discussion table, on the action agenda of the government, as well as the private sector for several years now. So this session will look at where Sri Lanka has been going, what are the entry points that we see in promoting business respect for human rights in Sri Lanka, what role the government can play, what is the role of National Human Rights Commission or other actors or investors or civil society groups and trade unions. So this session is going to look at this broader landscape of business and human rights in Sri Lanka. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce the 4 panelists that are going to take the floor one by one. So we have Dr. Dinesha Samaratne. She is a senior lecturer at the Department of Public and International Law, University of Colombo. So Dinesha, thank you very much for joining. Then we have Mr. Ashan Pereira, who is a social entrepreneur and founder of The Road to Rights, and he has worked extensively on sustainability issues and sustainable development goals. Thank you, Ashan, for joining us. Thirdly, we have Ms. Selena Perez. She is the director of Selena Exporters Private Limited. And of course, she has also advised businesses about the positive impact that they can make. So Selena, thank you very much for joining. Last but not least, we have Dr. Roshan Rajadurai, who is a spokesperson for Planters Association of Ceylon. Thank you, Roshan, for joining. And Roshan is working in this space for several decades, looking at different sectors, but in particular, the plantation industry in Sri Lanka for over 3 decades in sustainability issues. So, colleagues, I'm going to start with Dinesha. And the question that I would like you to address, Dinesha, is this. From your perspective as a public law scholar, we look at human rights typically in a vertical setting, state versus individual. But when we are talking about business and human rights, we're talking about the horizontal application of human rights. So if you can share with us the experiences of Sri Lanka on this particular issue, in particular, we will be interested to know what role the National Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, as well as the courts, can play in ensuring that businesses in Sri Lanka respect human rights. You have the floor, Dinesha. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya. And let me say I'm very happy to be here and to join this conversation. So the question you ask is obviously a very important one when we think about the extending the responsibility for respecting human rights by businesses. The short answer to your question is that public law itself doesn't allow for strong remedies in holding corporations and non-state actors accountable before courts, and I'll explain that very quickly. So the main remedy we have for respect for fundamental rights is the Supreme Court jurisdiction for determining fundamental rights petitions. Following India, we too follow the distinction between fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy. Most of the fundamental rights recognized in our constitution are civil and political rights, whereas economic social rights have found expression in directive principles of state policy. As with India, directive principles of state policy are non-enforceable, while fundamental rights are. Sri Lanka also does not provide for judicial review of legislation. So within this constitutional landscape, over time, the Supreme Court has, in certain situations, given a broad interpretation to civil and political rights, expanded it to, for instance, to include the right to access to education and also environmental rights. Also, by way of background, Sri Lanka is a dualist system. Again, in the exception, the judiciary has, in certain instances, directly incorporated standards of international law. And of course, as all of you here would know, Sri Lanka has ratified all the major human rights treaties. So in this background, under Article 126, you can only file a fundamental rights petition against executive or administrative actions or omissions. But again, over time, the judiciary has expanded the scope, and I will very briefly explain how they've done that. And I think that is relevant for understanding how businesses can be held accountable for human rights within the public law landscape. So one method has been to incorporate the public function test. If there are lawyers here, you would understand what this means, but very briefly, this is an approach where the court doesn't look at the source of power, but rather the nature of the power that is being exercised. So for instance, if a non-state actor has a monopoly in a particular sector, the court may be willing to extend public law principles in holding that authority, that non-state actor accountable. Along with the public function test, our judiciary has also used the idea of agency and agents and instrumentalities of the state to extend liability for human rights, where the state has been a stakeholder in incorporated companies. Apart from these two developments, the Supreme Court has in one occasion recognized the polluter pays principle and directly granted a remedy against a non-state actor. And finally, where a non-state actor acts under the color of the state. So with the endorsement of the state and with the protection of the state too, fundamental rights obligations have been extended. But speaking more directly as to whether a company can file a fundamental rights action, the court has said if you are an incorporated body, you may. If you are an unincorporated body, you cannot file a fundamental rights action as a body, but as individuals, you may go before court. Now, having described sort of the broad scope, let me just add these final remarks about the fundamental rights remedy and its effect. Allegations of violations of fundamental rights have to be made within 1 month. You require legal representation. We have a problem of severe delays in our entire legal system, and that includes the fundamental rights jurisdiction of the country, of the Supreme Court. And also you have to file this action before the Supreme Court, which is located in Colombo. So there's a geographical barrier as well. So in my work, I have highlighted the fact that while the fundamental rights chapter has been interpreted progressively by the Supreme Court in many instances, there are several access to justice issues that are involved in this, in seeking this remedy. Surya, you also mentioned the Human Rights Commission. This was established in 1996. And here too, we find a statutory limitation. As far as the Commission's powers of investigation and inquiry are concerned, the statute limits it to fundamental rights. But as far as its power of authority to engage in research and generate awareness, the language that is used is human rights. So there the scope has been broadened. Subject to whether the Commission has been able to work independently or not, on several occasions, our Human Rights Commission has been a very dynamic body, advancing the cause of human rights. But let me also add, we do have other statutory commissions which have been able to make an impact on the question of accountability, even of non-state actors. And one leading example in that regard would be the Right to Information Commission, and the way in which activists have been able to use the right to information to seek to get the information you need in order to query whether human rights have been violated in a certain situation or not. I will end there since my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dinesha, for this very quick overview of the legal landscape. You highlighted the potential, you highlighted the limitations, and you also showcased the creativity shown by the courts in the past to break those limitations in some creative way. So that is very helpful to understand that how the business and human rights landscape could evolve within these legal parameters. Now I would like to move on to the second panelist, Ashan. If I can ask you this question, because you have been a social entrepreneur, you have worked extensively about sustainability issues, in particular sustainable development goals. You have focused on climate change and sustainability, including the education. So what can you share based on your experiences as a young entrepreneur and activist? What can we learn from your experiences? What are the challenges you see? What are the future pathway forward for Sri Lanka and its businesses? And in particular, I'm interested to know more about climate change, if you can share. Where do we stand now and where should Sri Lanka be going, both the government and the businesses operating there? You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And first, I'm very happy to share the panel with all of you. Yeah, so answering to the question, we have been working on sustainable development goals for the past few years. Specifically, in the drafting process of sustainable development goals, we were able to gather the suggestions from the young people, and the people come from various parts of the country. And that made us understood the level of understanding of what the world that they want to see beyond 2050 and the country that they want to see by 2030. So we realized that there has to be a serious change of the decision-making processes in the country. At the same time, behavioral changes in our communities. So we led our individual actions in grassroots context. If I may highlight some of the successes, we were able to bring human rights and the sustainable development goals into the curriculum of University of Colombo. And that was a very challenging situation to promote human rights word, because that was a stigma back then in the country. And secondly, we also realized that to make the country sustainable, you really need to see the changes within the industry. So if you do not drive the industries in a correct context, it is very hard to meet the target. So we created the largest university undergraduate network, G17 University Ambassadors Consortium on Sustainability. And we realized that if we power up them, they are going to be the future potential young professionals who are going to work with the industry leaders in their respective industries. So today, the G17 network has gone to the global context as well. When it's come to the challenges, even though it's been 7 years adapting sustainable development goals, a majority of Sri Lankans do not know about sustainability. I'm not just talking about the general public. Again, when it's come to the government, even when it's come to the corporate sector, they still do not know what it is or what are the targets, how they could truly localize these sustainable development goals into their own culture. So it's very challenging to achieve by 2030. And the second challenge would be, again, not having reliable data uh, in the country. So sometimes not having this reliable data would challenge the people who are driving the sustainability agenda to make right decisions. So if I may highlight the climate change, I think in Sri Lanka, we have a very good conversation in the grassroots context to many parts of the society, but it's very challenging. Do the government and the individual feel enough urgency to address the climate emergency? So that is the question that we have today. So without feeling that urgency to it, I don't think we could actually drive and address the climate change that we are facing today. So now, if you look at Sri Lanka, we are also among the top 65 most vulnerable countries to face the climate change effect. So meaning that we are most at the risk. At the same time, it is threatening to the health, education, gender, environment, so on. So we seriously need immediate action. And also when we have the rising temperature again, so that would increase more unexpected natural disasters, and also that would impact some of the most important industries in the country: tourism, agriculture, again manufacturing, so on. But also, having said that, we have some of the policies, frameworks done by, again, UNDP, World Bank, Climate Change Secretariat. But the question is, again, are we at the right position to prioritize the climate action? Looking at the climate economic crisis in the country, I think the priority of having the climate action on top of the country's agenda, it's fading away, it's moving away. I think that is the situation we are in right now. So I think there has to be a serious discussion, because if we are going to have the negative effects of the climate change, we are going to face more greater economic crisis in the country and even regionally. So I think that when it's come to the government and the private sector, that we need to walk the talk now. I think there are so many businesses today transforming the way they have been operating their businesses. So even looking at entrepreneurs like Selena and some of the leading companies, they have changed the way they have been operating. But still, we really need to have more people to walk the talk. Secondly, I think government must prioritize sustainable development goals, not attaining 17 of them, but prioritize what is possible by 2030, so that we have a way forward beyond 2030. And thirdly, I also want to mention that we also need to move away from the greenwashing concept. I think we are expecting far greater action than just pushing CSR activities. We need to make sure that sustainability part of the overall governing process. And then lastly, to end, I would also like to highlight, we also need to promote the intergenerational dialogue within businesses and the private sector. When young people are bringing their innovative and the creative ideas to the table, and when the older generation is bringing their experiences, I think that is where we could design the way forward for the country. So the intergenerational dialogue is highly important for the whole issue that we are facing, and also to create a better way forward for the both people and the planet. So with that note, would love to have more engagement in the coming intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashan. I mean, you made several important points, but I would like to come back to a couple of points that you made. Especially, you mentioned that there is this potential perception of a clash between climate action and economic recovery or economic development. And I think that is perhaps a problematic understanding of this conflict. And you also highlighted the issue and the importance of education. So we'll come back to those hopefully in the given time. But I would like to now move on to the third panelist. And Selena, if I can now invite you, and you have been of course, running this business, but you also have been advising companies to do fair trade. Why this idea of fair trade matters to businesses in Sri Lanka? And what has been your experience? Are businesses in Sri Lanka receptive to this idea of fair trade when you tell them? And are they really willing to be part of this transformative positive impact journey? And what has been the challenges? What is the positives that we can take, and what are the limitations you see from your perspective? You have the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me at this session. So maybe before I dive right into your question, Surya, I'll take a minute to really explain my background slightly. So I am head of business development of a social enterprise, 30 years old in Sri Lanka. Primarily, we work with women. We target women who are vulnerable in that sense, who are really unable to find work in the formal economy in the country. So, I mean, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of it, but there is a huge component of that population in Sri Lanka, and that is the population that has been worst affected also during COVID. So what we do at Selena is really give them the access to work by giving them flexible working models. So work from home, start your own business, work for half a day, take your work home. I mean, it's an operational nightmare, but being a fair trade company, I always tell my team, we go out of the way to make sure that we are part of and delivering on our mission. So very lastly, I want to say, we understand at Selena, and also being a woman myself and a recent mother, I realized that just having a job is just like 20% of what we have to do to really be empowered. So our foundation is set up to give the financial management programs, the sexuality education, menstrual hygiene awareness, different aspects, which the community tells us that they need. And then we kind of help them to, we empower, I hate that word empower, but for the sake of discussion, we give them those skills to stay at work, from daycare to the various things that women need to do to really be economically engaged and contribute to their homes and communities. So that's why I took the time to explain that is the social enterprise operational model on which we work, which is guided by the fair trade principles. And of course, to sell our product, we are a completely self-sustained model. So we sell our product, we retail it, and we export it, and we fund all this we fund our operational model, which has a very strong social impact. So that is a social enterprise model. So when I get invited, of course, to speak to different companies about this model, about how it can work, about the challenges we have. And I think first and foremost, there is a lack of understanding about what a social enterprise is. So it is not CSR. Because it doesn't have a separate budget at Selena. I think, if you're running businesses, finances is the end all and the be all and the kind of direction that we take, right? We are guided by our financial kind of advice. So CSR often comes as a separate budget, but when you're a social enterprise, social and environmental impact is embedded into your operational model. So one of the first challenges that I face when I go to talk about my model is the lack of understanding about and the differentiation between a social enterprise and a CSR initiative. So, and that is a hurdle to overcome, because it does take understanding that business can do good. And sometimes when I speak to mainstream industries, that connection is blurred. Not that it's not possible, it is absolutely possible. And there are many examples around the world and even in Sri Lanka who enable the doing good is good for business philosophy. But that attitude, I think, is the first challenge that I have. So it also depends on who's talking to me, right? So if the sustainability unit or the HR unit is talking to me, it is more on a CSR aspect. But if a business unit is talking to me, now we are talking. It's a different kind of attitude and thinking, right? So that I would say is the first kind of challenge. But this is overcome to an extent if the leadership believes in this. So I don't even waste my time if the leadership isn't the one I'm speaking to. And I mean, not to say I only respond to leaders, but my point is that if it's similar in my company, my mother is the founder, I'm the next generation lead. It takes leadership to go out of the way. Because during COVID, we saw we had our financial advisors telling us, protect your cash flows. Your reserves have to be intact in 6 months so you can overtake your competition and come back to business, because now everyone was facing problems. And now on how do you protect your reserves? You have to get rid of your staff, those, and we are in an industry that was severely hit by COVID. We didn't make profit during COVID. We still are not making profit, in fact. But the leadership at that point is crucial. If the leadership says, look, this is what we are doing. We are going out of our way. Our community, our environment is important. Then it becomes an easier journey to take. So a challenge is the leadership embracing this, and you can overcome that challenge when you have the leadership on board. And I would say the final kind of overarching challenge to this kind of thinking integrated into business is the resources. Now, the leadership can say, I want to do this. But if the company, especially at an SME level, has limited resources in time, in money, in people with the understanding of this aspect, it becomes very, very difficult to work and to integrate this kind of thinking, because like I said, it's not a CSR program. It's a changing of your operational model, a tweaking, a transformation of your operational model to enable a win-win situation for people, planet, and profit. So it's definitely possible. And there are times when profit may have to take a backseat. There may be times when you can't do everything that you want for the community. There may be time when products can't be launched because it affects the environment. But each of these decisions have to be taken with people, planet, profit, and the triple bottom line in focus. So maybe the last thing to say, I think Sri Lanka as a nation, and I truly believe this despite everything that's happening around us right now, we are good people. It's very simply put, right? At the core of who we are as a nation, guided by our multi-religious, multicultural background, to do what is right by community comes natural to us. So the challenge is not that businesses are not eager to take this on. I think there's a lot of businesses who would very much like to take this on, and it's in fact embedded in themselves. But the challenge becomes what I said, the leadership, the resource mobilization, and this understanding of how you can create a win-win situation, which of course is a case-by-case analysis. So yeah, that's what I want to share.
Thank you so much. And I know the time is limited, but you made very interesting points about the distinction that you drew between CSR and the social enterprise, the importance that you gave to the issue of leadership and the resources. And I think resources, when we talk about, it's not merely financial resources, it could be the technical resources, it could be the time, the issue that you highlighted in relation to SMEs, for instance. So very important points, and hopefully we'll come back to some of these points. But before we go to the fourth speaker, the final speaker, I would also like to encourage participants to post questions. So if you have any questions to any particular speaker, or you have some general broad questions to the whole panel, please use the chat function to post those questions. And in the meantime, you ask questions. Let me now invite Roshan, you to share with us your experience. As I mentioned while introducing you, I mean, you have worked in this space of sustainability in the plantation sector, rubber, tea, which are core industries in Sri Lanka for many, many years. So what challenges you see for the private sector in Sri Lanka from integrating sustainability? Because there are always these competing considerations to make quick profit. And what are the challenges you see on the ground? In particular, I will be interested to know about the labor rights situations, because plantation is very human resource intensive enterprise. So if you can share some insights for us, that would be very useful. Roshan, you have the floor.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Surya. Quickly to dive into the subject, I think because of the international audience, it's important that I very briefly and succinctly give a quick introduction to the agricultural, mainly the plantation sector of Sri Lanka. You know, in Ceylon is known for its tea, and we have about 1.5 million in the tea smallholder sector engaged in tea cultivation, plus another 1 million people resident in the formal sector. That's a company sector. That's about 2.5 million in the tea sector. Then combined with tea, rubber, coconut, and other export crops, we have further million. So in short, what I'm trying to tell you is that out of a population of 21 million, almost 2.5 million to 3 million people are directly engaged in the plantation crops. So it's a very significant economic and social segment. And I'm mainly talking about the formal plantation sector, which I represent. And in Sri Lanka, the feature of agriculture, plantation agriculture, is that about 70 to 75% of the crop comes from the smallholder sector. So I'm basically talking of the formal sector of 25%. And our approach is, as discussed earlier in this forum, more than the rights of workers, is a managerial duty and responsibility and care. Why I say that is we have a 150-year-old legacy of tea and rubber plantation management. And traditionally, it has been a very paternalistic management, because we look after not only employment, look after the total health, sanitation, housing, social welfare, community welfare aspect of more than 1 million people resident in our plantations, although about 125,000 people actually work. So it's workers, non-workers, and it's a 24-hour operation right throughout the year. So the classic example of this is when we had the COVID outbreak. We had an enormous impact suddenly because of the lack of work outside. There was a reverse migration, and our population swelled. Although people reside in the states, they work outside. But we can claim very proudly that for over a year, we didn't have a single COVID case, because the government, realizing the economic value of the segment, immediately permitted us to start operations. We stopped for 3 days, and quickly our management on the ground in the smallholder sector, in the corporate sector, got into action. We organized the transport, the factories, the logistics, the food, and in the corporate sector, our care was total. From personal temperature checking up to the level of fumigating the houses with the assistance of the government institutions, and then going up to isolation quarters. And in fact, in terms of food, we provided food to their doorstep, because these people live in large communities of 10, 15,000 people, and they have to go to bazaars and townships close by. That will be an opportunity for spread of COVID. So management got food packs and delivered it to their doorsteps, thereby preventing people's movement. And no retrenchment. In fact, we increased our workforce because people had to work and find livelihood to keep themselves going. And we opened out the estates for people who did not work on the plantations to come and work. So in general, as you said, more than the rights of workers, it was our approach in terms of duties and responsibilities to the community that we were in charge of. We have a very, very comprehensive total custodial care in the plantation sector, so much so that other tea economies in the world have come and visited Sri Lanka to see our unique ethical and sustainable management processes. When I say total custodial care, like even a worker from conception to 6 months after childbirth, we take total custodial care from prenatal, postnatal services. And after 6 months, we take care of that child, and we have total custodial care of the child up to 5 years in child development centers. So from conception to up to 5 years, the mother and the child are given a lot of services to support their that stage of their life cycle. In addition to that, we continue to train the workers in terms of their rights and duties, and we have comprehensive awareness programs promoting human rights, gender equality, violence, discriminations, and we are the first plantation industry in the world to sign up for mother and child-friendly plantations. And we have a very, very strong statutory provision, and of course, interested stakeholders ensuring that they have freedom of association. I would claim that they have the strongest union in the plantation sector anywhere in the world. In Sri Lanka, represented by 7 or 8 members of parliament. And a special feature of our employment is the worker can decide not to come for work whenever he feels like. There's no compulsion to work. And in terms of management, we have open door policy, and we have a very good understanding with our workers. So as I mentioned earlier, we are highly conformant to global certifications like Ethical Tea Partnership. Sri Lanka is branded as one of the countries promoting ethical tea. Then Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, Forest Stewardship certification. These are all certifications and conformances requiring a lot of social obligations and duties. So in that sense, I think Sri Lanka has fulfilled its role in aligning ourselves with ensuring the rights and the privileges and the provisions that the plantation workers, in particular in this case, are given. We have some sort of brands like United Nations Global Compact. We are featured in a Home for Every Plantation Worker. There have been a lot of case studies. So basically, in short, what I'm trying to say is that we do not look at the rights of workers as an important thing, because historically and legacy-wise, we have been providing a care and concern and duty and responsibility kind of approach to our management, because we care for a total population, irrespective of workers and non-workers, living in our plantations. And this kind of a facility, to a certain degree, extends to the smallholder sector as well. So basically, that's introduction about our model, and I'll be free and I'll be available for any questions arising from this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roshan. And again, a fascinating overview that you highlighted, that how important the plantation industry is for Sri Lanka, and how the industry has tried to respond to unprecedented pandemic. And you shared some concrete examples of that. Now, if all the panelists could be spotlighted and brought together, I would have some questions for panelists, and we also got a question in the chat box, and I will encourage participants to post more questions if there are any. So the one question that we have in the chat box is perhaps more appropriate for Dinesha, and the question is that can you explain the interface between judiciary and the National Human Rights Commission in Sri Lanka in relation to the cases related to the private sector, Dinesha? Yes. If you can briefly respond to that, that would be very much appreciated. But I also want to ask another question. Perhaps, Ashan, you can reflect on that question in the meantime. The question that I have for you is, you highlighted that the government in Sri Lanka, or in the companies in Sri Lanka, perhaps see a conflict between climate action and the development. So how can we overcome this conflict? And you also mentioned about that the government of Sri Lanka should perhaps give priority to certain SDGs rather than all 17. So then my question for you, Ashan, is that will that not result in what we call a cherry picking? You focus on certain SDGs and you ignore the others. So I want you to reflect on these questions. I'll come back to you, but I want to start with Dinesha first, the question about NHRC. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya, and thank you for that question. So as I mentioned in my preliminary remarks, the Human Rights Commission's mandate is in 2 parts. Much of its mandate related to investigation and inquiry pertains to fundamental rights as recognized in the Constitution. It is only in relation to education, research, and awareness raising that the Commission has the mandate to consider human rights, which is the much broader concept. Looking at the interface between the Commission and the judiciary, the statute which establishes the Commission recognizes that the Commission may intervene in fundamental rights litigation before the Supreme Court. But in general, at a practical level, The Human Rights Commission, unlike the Supreme Court, has officers across the country. And wherever there is a potential human rights violation by a business, the way to approach the Human Rights Commission is to approach it from the regulatory lens, to try and identify the public authorities responsible for regulating the business, and then to re-articulate that in terms of fundamental rights. So that's my short response, Surya. I do have a much different intervention that I would like to make. So whenever time permits, if you could let me do that, I would be grateful, please.
Thank you, Dinesha. I'll come back to that. Another observation that you may have to share. So Asha, the question that I posed to you, I don't know if you want to reflect, but there's also a question for perhaps Selena, you may wish to respond after Ashan.
Yeah.
That question is about leadership. How can we promote this idea of leadership on the part of private sector entities? That they look beyond profit, between people, planet, and the profit. Often the triple bottom line idea, that kind of a leadership in many companies. So it is not a minority thing, it becomes a mainstream thing. So I'll come back to if you have a response.
Ashan, after you, I think.
Ashan,
Okay,
you
yes.
can go.
Thank you. Yeah, so the question
Go
was,
now,
I think,
and Selena.
yeah. So I would respond why I thought that we need to prioritize sustainable development goals. Because with the COVID pandemic, we have actually faced serious challenges, not locally, even globally. I think if you are to meet all the targets and the indicators by 2030, we need to achieve the set targets by 2025 and then complete rest of the targets or objectives by 2030. I think that is not really possible in the global context. So I think not only Sri Lanka and some of the other countries must prioritize their goals looking at their local context. So I would say to Sri Lanka, we should highly prioritize goal number 7, clean energy and the power up solar energy and going clean energy process. And goal number 12, responsible consumption and production. And again, goal number 6, clean water and sanitation. And then goal number 15, life on land. Goal number 14, life below water. Goal number 13, climate action. And all the environmental goals. And then lastly, goal number 9, and the innovation and the digital infrastructure. So when you have
that is very interesting, Ashan. So, sorry to interject,
Okay.
but that is very interesting.
Yeah.
I never I don't easily see people creating this kind of an order amongst the SDGs. What I found missing from your order is many, but I would say SDG 5. Why gender equality is not as part of your list?
Yes, I think that's a very good question. So I think gender equality has to come each and every single goal. Even if you look at the climate change, it has to, we are talking of the climate justice and how climate change is going to affect the poverty and the education and the gender. Even if you look at goal number 6, even so that is, I think the gender has to be a part of each and every single agenda. But for a country to drive economically, I think we need to prioritize all our environmental goals and then the goals that would drive industries and sustainably and even driving the clean energy processes and all of that. But when it's come to gender, yes, absolutely, that has to be a part of each and every single goal, as I believe. So in that case,
Very good response.
the education would come into it and then the other goals would come into it. So that's why I was just prioritize the core agendas that we should invest highly on it. So yeah. So,
very much appreciated. If you don't mind, I want to move on to a couple of other questions. I'm conscious of the time, but I want to pick up as many questions as possible. So Selena, there's a question for you that I asked, but I also wanted to flag a question that Lalanath has posed, and perhaps Roshan, you may reflect on that question. The question is about European Commission's last month directive on mandatory human rights due diligence, and that may impact some plantation companies which are selling their products, let us say tea or something else, in European market. So how that directive is going to impact the big multinationals, including supply chains of Sri Lanka. So I think if you want to respond to that question. But before we go there, I want to give the chance to Selena, the question that I asked you about leadership.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, I mean, in a nutshell, Surya, I think because I come from a very different I have a varied background. I worked as a policy specialist. I've been in the development sector, worked with government, and I'm now finally with private sector. And what I have realized is if we don't make, when I say we, I am yet to define, I think it depends on who we are talking to, but together, if there is no business case created for the integration of the BHR agenda, the fair trade principles, and the various other ethical and environmental factors, there has to be a business case created in order for there to be total integration of this thinking. And I really empathize with my colleagues in the tea sector in Sri Lanka as well, because finally, who is paying the premium? I mean, we can all talk, right? But the world is running on economics. When you are looking at this in a very macro sense, people who are ethical and sustainable are fighting in a world where business is conducted as usual. Usually, there is a premium that is attached to this being ethical, to being fair, right? To being, who is paying that premium? It unfortunately, like, remove all the romantic stuff out. It comes down to that. Right? So unless there's a global phenomena to change business as usual, industries that are large find it very difficult, despite its very good intentions, to integrate fully into their supply chains and their operational models this kind of philosophies and thinking, right? So here is actually where leadership can be in twofold, right? There can be leaders who set trends in their businesses. They can take the cuts that are necessary, make those decisions, and set an example for others. It's not easy when you're publicly owned, you have shareholders asking for their dividends. It's not easy. So this is where SMEs, smaller businesses can play the role, but to inspire, perhaps like Selene is doing. But then you need, the next set is you need leaders to sit down and think, how can I make the business case for this? And that is going to require some hard decisions, having the correct people in the room. So I think it's a trajectory and a process that, you see the best practices, you see how it can be done in a smaller scale, and then you try to see how it can be done in a bigger scale. But for all of this, it's leadership. Because if you don't have the boardroom talking about this, discussing this, and then backing it up with numbers, this is not going to go anywhere, and we are always going to have the rights organizations and the businesses against each other in any kind of discussions. But there is an overlap that can be made. But for that, I think it requires a sitting on one table to understand the business case for this. I very much support this. I'm speaking from experience.
Sure. I think we can definitely have a much longer discussion about the business case. The time of next 10 minutes may not allow full grappling of that issue, but I think perhaps one dimension of that business, I don't like the term business case for various reasons, but the push and pull factors. And I think one of the factors could be the European Commission's directive on mandatory human rights due diligence, including environmental due diligence. So Roshan, if you want to reflect on that question that was posed.
Thank you, Surya. Let me first again reiterate my point that I made. Sri Lankan plantation industry, particularly tea, is the world's most certified tea industry. I was talking about ethical tea partnership, the fair trade, the rainforest alliance, then forest stewardship certificates. These are all global certificates which have very high standards of compliance and conformance. Sometimes not practical, but we have no choice. because 95% of our tea is exported overseas, probably to European and other countries. And it is a requirement to be in business, to be conformant. So initially it was a matter of conformance, but now it's a matter of adoption because we have realized the benefit. We could quantify, but we can see a benefit of these things percolating right down to the worker level. In terms of sustainability, I think I must confirm and reassure that ours, particularly tea, is a vegetative crop. And if we do not take, and we are very conscious of the fact that any slight change in our microclimate will have a significant effect in terms of quality, quantity, and livelihoods of workers. And we take maximum effort to ensure that proper environmental and geophysical conservation and other methods are adopted. So much so we don't talk about it much. Plantation companies have won presidential, national, even Asia sustainability awards. So we are not talking about it because it's part of the business, but just to give the assurance, both in terms of human rights and labor rights, and in terms of climate change impacts, it's well under our microscope. It's been managed well.
Thank you, Roshan. I think these are important factors that you're mentioning, but I'm not sure personally if certification would satisfy the European Commission's directive, because they're asking something different now under this. I mean, this is not in force yet. This may take a couple of years. And I think if the companies are certified, that is definitely going to be helpful. But I think that itself will not fix the issue, because what is expected is continuous human rights and environmental due diligence. I see, Selena, you want to come back. So if you can take the floor briefly, thank you.
Yeah, very briefly. Also, certifications are expensive. So if we are to meet the requirements that are coming from the EU Green Deal and all the directives that are talking about, I think, for as long as I know, all this I'm going to use this word, imposition comes from a northern hemisphere onto this trade discussion, right? The standards, the trades and the standards and all of that, which is fair enough, right? But I think it's time for people in the global south to take a step back and think, okay, how are we going to reduce our costs while being more transparent, so we can sell our product in a better way into the European and US markets. So at Selena, again, we are doing a blockchain integration. I'm using the word blockchain simply because you listen when I say blockchain, but it's simply using technology to have greater transparency in our supply chains, right? And this just means that we can cut out certifications. So the Green Deal comes in 2030. We have around 7 years to pilot this and show to Europe that actually there are companies in Sri Lanka, and I'm hoping when we implement it, I know there are certain players also in the tea industry who's doing this. Then when we implement it, there are best case practices coming from Sri Lanka to try to ensure full transparency, because that's what you need, right? You need to see that the directive, the due diligence, and the kind of different environmental indicators are met by companies in Sri Lanka. So I feel this is a very good way to do this. But the challenge is when you don't own your supply chain fully, or when the value chain is really broken, like such as it is in the tea industry, it becomes very challenging. But I think there's technology out there that can be applied to even the most traditional of industries. Handloom has a 2,500-year history in this country. So that we can overcome to meet some of the what's coming at us. But the global south, we need to take the initiative. We shouldn't be waiting for this to be sent.
Good point.
Surya, I quickly want to add something, one sentence, if I may, with your permission. I know the consuming countries have a lot of impositions on us, but there was a recent study done a couple of years back by Want company organization UK. They showed that the tea producer, I'm talking of tea, if he gets less than 1%. The profit goes to the retailer, 53%, and blender 33%. So what we are asking is, we want an equitable and a fair distribution of the gain, if there is. So while there are demands for human rights and certifications, I think at the producer's end, we carry the triple burden of the land, the human resource, and the product. we should be compensated in a more equitable manner.
I can't agree more. Roshan, that was an excellent point, and people often don't make that point. So I just want to make two quick observations and then bring in Dinesha because she wanted to say something as well. My first point is that even if these regulations are coming of the global north, as Selena was talking about, we should appreciate that the standards are global. The UN guiding principles, ILO standards, or human rights as such, these are not North or South standards. These are global standards. Governments and companies all over the world are expected to respect human rights, period. It's not about Asian values or North or South. That's my first point. Second point, and connecting with Roshan, I think it is absolutely vital that the brands, whether they are in the North or in the South, they have to stop exploitation in their supply chains. Their purchasing practices have to be fair and equitable so that the suppliers, the plantation companies, the workers on the agricultural farms, they get a fair share of what is being sold. That is absolutely vital, I think, towards responsible business conduct. We just have 3 minutes left. Dinesha, quickly, I know you wanted to say something, so you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya. I'll just say this very quickly because we couldn't touch on it during our discussion. The current economic crisis we are in can be explained in different ways, but there is a story to be told about the complicity of businesses. And the interface comes again with regulation by the state. So any conversation on Sri Lanka looking at business and human rights has to try and capture that as well. I'll leave it there.
Yes, thank you. Complicity is definitely another issue, a larger webinar perhaps we need. And of course, we perhaps also need other issues about the whole business models. And Roshan highlighted, Selena highlighted the practices and the business dimensions. And of course, we have to work together and sit together and see how we can create more incentives for businesses. And at the same time, we also need to create disincentives, in my view, for free riders. Because if there are companies which are free riding and exploiting the workers or polluting the environment, or are not willing to buy the climate action agenda of ASEAN, then those companies have to be punished for that, right? So I think the market has to be created, in my view, for more responsible business practices. Now, there are other questions in the chat box. Perhaps I will not have time to pick up any further questions, but I would like to wrap it up by highlighting the important work that has gone behind in organizing this third UN South Asia Forum. So UNDP team, the ILO team, and all other partners who have made this forum, which will start formally on the 29th of March. And these side sessions, very important that we acknowledge their contributions. I would like to invite all of you to appreciate the people who work behind it. I also want to acknowledge the technical facilitation role provided by Q Design. So without their help, we could not have had this session in a virtual form in a smooth manner. So thank you, everyone, for sharing this. And I think I will also encourage you to join other sessions and join the formal sessions of the forum next week. Thank you and bye for now. And see you around in other sessions. Thank you also for the panelists for joining us.
Goodbye to all.
Thanks, Surya.